The video reached me at 11:47 p.m., just minutes before Christmas Day began, and by the time I pressed play, I already knew my life would never sit in its old place again. Before the story goes any further, please subscribe, share this story, and press the bell icon on the YouTube channel Silent Revenge Story so you don't miss what happens next. The screen shook as my neighbor's hand adjusted the phone. I could hear laughter before I saw faces, sharp, careless laughter that didn't belong to Joy. Then my daughter appeared in the frame. My child, standing in the living room of her in-laws' house, her shoulders pulled inward, her hands locked together as if she were trying to hold herself together from breaking apart. She was wearing the same blue sweater she'd worn when she left our house that morning, the one I'd said looked warm enough for the cold. Someone off camera clapped mockingly. Another voice said something about Christmas charity, and then the laughter came again, louder this time. My son-in-law stepped into view, holding his phone up like a trophy, recording her from inches away. His mother's voice followed, sweet and cruel at the same time, telling my daughter to smile because Christmas was about happiness. I felt my chest tighten, like a rope had been pulled around my ribs. My hands trembled, and I had to sit down before my legs gave up. I wanted to shout at the screen, to pull her out of it somehow, but all I could do was watch as they circled her with words sharp enough to cut skin. They mocked her family, they mocked her upbringing, they laughed about the gifts she'd brought, simple things, wrapped neatly, chosen with care. One of them opened a box, held it up, and said it was too cheap for a respectable family. The room erupted again, and my daughter's eyes dropped to the floor. I raised her alone after her mother passed. I worked late nights, skipped meals, wore the same coat for years so she could have books, shoes, and dignity. I taught her to be gentle, to believe that patience could soften hard hearts. Watching that video, I realized patience had only taught her how to endure cruelty quietly. The worst moment wasn't the laughter. It was when she tried to speak. Her lips moved, her voice barely audible, asking them to stop. My son-in-law waved his hand dismissively and told her not to ruin Christmas with drama. Someone shoved a Santa hat onto her head, crooked and mocking, and told her to pose for the camera. That was when I felt something tear inside me. Not anger yet, something deeper. A grief so heavy it pressed tears from my eyes without permission. I had failed her. I had trusted the wrong people with the most precious thing I had left in this world. The video ended abruptly. My neighbor sent a short message underneath. "I'm sorry. I didn't know how else to tell you." I stared at the dark screen, my reflection looking back at me, older, smaller, and hollowed out. Outside, fireworks popped somewhere in the distance. Somewhere, families were hugging, praying, forgiving. In my house, Christmas Eve sat like a wound left open. I tried calling my daughter. No answer. Again, still nothing. Every unanswered ring felt like another confirmation that she was alone in that house, surrounded by people who enjoyed breaking her down. I remembered the day she married him, how proud he looked, how his family smiled just enough to seem kind. I remembered the doubt in my chest that I had ignored because I wanted her to be happy, because I was tired of being afraid for her. That night I didn't sleep. I replayed the video over and over, noticing new details each time. The way she flinched when someone raised their voice, the way she wiped her eyes quickly, as if tears were a failure she wasn't allowed to show. Pain isn't loud at first, it's quiet. It sits with you, breathes with you, and waits. By dawn, I knew this pain wasn't something I could pray away or forget. It had planted itself inside me, steady and patient, and it was waiting to become something else. Morning came without mercy. I drove to their house while the sky was still pale, my eyes burning from a night without rest, my heart pounding with questions that had no answers yet. I told myself I would just check on her, that I would stay calm, that I wouldn't make things worse. Fathers lie to themselves when fear is too heavy to carry honestly. Before the door even opened, I heard voices. Laughter again. The same kind. When my son-in-law's sister opened the door, she looked surprised to see me, then amused as if my presence was part of the entertainment. She didn't invite me in. She stepped aside just enough to let me see what they had already prepared. My daughter stood in the center of the living room, the same room from the video, but now it looked different. A phone was set up on a small tripod. Another one was in someone's hand. The Christmas tree blinked behind her, colorful and cheerful, mocking the heaviness in the air. Her eyes met mine for half a second before dropping again, and in that instant I saw something worse than tears. I saw shame that wasn't hers to carry. Someone said, "Oh look, her father is here," like an announcement at a show. My son-in-law smiled, wide and careless, and told me I'd arrived just in time. He said they were doing a family Christmas live, sharing memories, laughs, and lessons. Lessons. That word echoed in my head as I realized what they meant. They began talking about her mistakes, about how she didn't understand their lifestyle, how she was modern enough. Each sentence landed like a slap. When she tried to step back, his mother gently but firmly pushed her forward, straight into the frame of the camera. I saw the red light blinking. Live. People were watching. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. I had never felt so useless. Years of protecting her, and now I was standing there, watching strangers type comments while my daughter's dignity was being torn apart for amusement. Someone read comments aloud, laughing at cruel words from people who didn't even know her name. They made her apologize, not for anything specific, just apologize for being sensitive, for being ungrateful, for embarrassing them by crying the night before. She spoke softly, her voice shaking, each word forced out like a confession she didn't believe in. The room stayed quiet, not out of respect, but anticipation, waiting for her to say something wrong so they could pounce again. I took a step forward. My son-in-law raised his hand slightly, not touching me, just enough to warn me. He whispered that if I interfered, it would only prove their point. That they would tell everyone how dramatic her family was, that they would make sure she paid for it later. Public humiliation doesn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like smiling faces and polite cruelty. Sometimes it's wrapped in holiday lights and filtered through a camera lens so it looks harmless to outsiders. But I could feel it crushing her from the inside. They handed her a gift at the end, a large box. Everyone clapped as she opened it. Inside was a cheap apron with the words "Know Your Place" printed across the front. Laughter exploded. Someone zoomed in on her face. She froze, then slowly folded the apron and held it like it mattered. I don't remember leaving the house. I remember being outside, cold air filling my lungs, my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my skin. The humiliation hadn't been just hers. It had been shared, broadcast, stamped into the world where it could never be taken back. That night the video appeared everywhere. Short clips, edited pieces, comments multiplying faster than I could read them. Some people laughed, some defended her, but the damage was done. My daughter didn't come home, she didn't answer my calls. And as I sat alone, staring at the glow of my phone, I understood something terrible and clear. They thought they had won. They thought silence would follow. They didn't know that humiliation, once it reaches a certain depth, stops being pain and starts becoming resolve. After the noise came the quiet, and it was heavier than anything that had come before. The house felt too big without her voice, too empty without the small sounds she used to make without realizing, cups being set down gently, the soft hum she made when she was thinking. I expected grief to scream inside me, but instead it sat still, watching, waiting. I didn't post anything. I didn't reply to the messages that poured in after the clip spread. Some were full of sympathy, others curiosity disguised as concern. A few carried the same cruelty I'd seen in that living room, asking why I'd raised my daughter to be so weak. I read them all and answered none. Silence became my only shield. Days passed, Christmas ended. The world moved on the way it always does, indifferent to private disasters. My daughter finally came home one evening without warning. She stood at the door like a guest, a small bag in her hand, eyes hollow but dry. I didn't ask questions. I took the bag, set it down, and hugged her. She didn't cry. She just held on as if letting go might break something permanently. We didn't talk about what happened, not because it wasn't important, but because words felt dangerous. I cooked. She ate a little. I sat nearby, listening to her breathe, measuring each rise and fall like proof she was still here. At night, I heard her packing, stopping, packing again, as if sleep had forgotten her address. Her in-laws sent messages, polite ones, carefully written apologies that apologized for nothing. They asked when she would come back. They asked if we were calming down. I deleted them without responding. My son-in-law called once. I let it ring until it stopped. The quiet that followed felt like choosing a side without saying it out loud. In silence, I began to see clearly. I replayed every interaction, every small insult I had brushed aside before, every moment I had mistaken arrogance for confidence. I realized they had always believed they were untouchable. Wealth, connections, public image, these things had wrapped them in a sense of safety that made cruelty feel consequence-free. My daughter spoke one night while we washed dishes. Just one sentence. She said she didn't want revenge. She said she just wanted to disappear from their lives without making anything worse. I nodded and said nothing, but inside me something hardened. Disappearing would only teach them that humiliation worked. Silence changed shape after that. It wasn't empty anymore. It became active, deliberate. I stopped attending gatherings. I declined invitations. When mutual acquaintances brought up the incident, I listened calmly and said very little. People grew uncomfortable. Silence has a way of unsettling those who expect noise. Behind closed doors, I prepared without letting it show. I gathered screenshots, full recordings, unedited files. I spoke to people quietly, asked careful questions, learned things they assumed no one outside their circle would notice. I moved slowly, patiently, the way pain teaches you to move when rushing has already cost too much. My daughter watched me sometimes, as if sensing a shift she couldn't name. I kept my voice gentle, my routines normal. I wanted her to feel safe before anything else. Power doesn't announce itself. It settles in when no one is looking. The world forgot the video quickly. New scandals arrived. New jokes replaced old ones. Her in-laws relaxed. Their posts returned to smiling dinners and filtered happiness. They thought the storm had passed. They thought silence meant surrender. One evening, my daughter slept through the night for the first time since she came home. I sat alone in the living room, the house finally still, and understood that silence was no longer about enduring. It was about timing, about letting them grow comfortable again, about waiting until the moment when their laughter would have no place to hide. The first sign of change was subtle, the kind most people miss because they're too busy admiring themselves. Invitations to their events started going unanswered. A business deal my son-in-law had been boasting about quietly stalled. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just small disruptions, like stones placed carefully under smooth wheels. I didn't confront them. I didn't warn them. Power doesn't need permission. I reached out to people they depended on but never respected. The assistant who knew their schedules better than they did. The cousin who handled finances but was treated like furniture. The neighbor who had recorded the original video and still felt guilty enough to be honest. Stories unfolded. Screenshots multiplied. Patterns emerged. My daughter noticed the shift before I explained anything. She asked why her husband had started calling again, why his messages sounded nervous instead of demanding. I told her healing wasn't about running backward into fear. I told her to take her time. I told her she didn't owe anyone a response. Public image was their oxygen. I understood that now. The same platforms they'd used to humiliate her became fragile glass walls once truth pressed against them. I didn't break those walls yet. I just tapped them gently, in the right places, so cracks began to appear where only they could hear. A mutual friend called one afternoon, lowering his voice as if secrets could travel through phones. He asked if everything was okay, said there were rumors, said people were asking questions. I listened and thanked him for his concern. Silence again, but this time it carried weight. People lean closer when answers aren't handed to them. My son-in-law showed up at the house without warning. He looked smaller somehow, his confidence replaced by forced smiles and restless hands. He apologized in broad, empty phrases. He blamed stress. He blamed misunderstandings. He never mentioned the video. He never said my daughter's name with respect. I let him speak until he ran out of words. Then I told him calmly that my daughter was safe, and that was all he needed to know. I didn't threaten him. I didn't raise my voice. I watched his face shift as he realized something important had changed and he couldn't locate it. Behind the scenes, consequences lined up quietly. Sponsors hesitated. Invitations thinned. Someone leaked an unedited clip, not the cruel jokes but the silence afterward, the part where my daughter stood still while laughter died awkwardly. That silence made people uncomfortable. It asked questions without asking. My daughter began to stand straighter. She laughed softly at a show one night, surprising herself. Power doesn't always roar back. Sometimes it returns as breath, as rest, as the ability to sleep without fear. The family that had humiliated her sensed the ground moving. They tried to control the narrative, posting carefully worded messages about forgiveness and unity. The comments weren't kind anymore. People had learned to read between lines. Sympathy shifted sides. I realized then that the power had already changed hands. They just hadn't accepted it yet. They were still playing the old game, using the old rules, unaware that the board had been turned around. One evening, my daughter asked me if this would ever end. I told her yes. I told her it would end when truth finished what cruelty started. She nodded, trusting me in a way that both humbled and steadied me. Power shift isn't about domination. It's about removing the illusion of control. And as I watched their perfect image begin to fracture under its own weight, I knew the moment was approaching when silence would give way to something they could no longer laugh off. The moment came not with anger but with precision. On a quiet evening when their guard was down and their smiles had returned just enough to seem believable, everything they had ignored was placed directly in front of them. Not leaked in fragments, not whispered through rumors, presented whole. The original video was released again, this time uncut, unfiltered, and accompanied by context they could no longer control. The laughter, the commands, the forced apology, the apron. But what changed everything was the added footage they never knew existed. The moments before and after, the planning, the jokes about views, the casual way they discussed how humiliation would teach her. It spread faster than the first clip ever had. People who had laughed before fell silent. People who had defended them disappeared. Comment sections turned from mockery to disbelief, then to outrage. The same platforms that once amplified cruelty now magnified consequence. My son-in-law called repeatedly. Texts arrived in waves, pleading, then threatening, then pleading again. His parents issued a statement within hours, claiming misunderstanding, editing, malice. But the uncut footage left no room for excuses. You can argue intention. You can't argue recorded reality. Brands distanced themselves publicly. Events quietly canceled invitations. Friends who had once stood proudly beside them stepped away, unwilling to be associated with something so undeniable. The shock wasn't just public, it was personal. They had never imagined losing control this completely, this quickly. My daughter watched none of it at first. I told her only that she was believed. When she finally did look, she didn't smile. There was no celebration in her eyes, just release, as if a weight she'd been carrying without knowing it had finally been set down. They tried to reach her directly. Apologies now had tears behind them, promises of change, offers of counseling. They wanted forgiveness the way they once wanted entertainment, immediately and on their terms. She didn't answer. The revenge shocked them because it wasn't loud. There were no insults, no countermockery. just truth standing upright, refusing to move aside. That kind of revenge doesn't fade with time. It settles in records, in screenshots, in memory. One morning, my neighbor knocked again, eyes wide, phone in hand. He said people were calling it a turning point. He said others were coming forward with their own stories about that family. Patterns surfaced. This wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was a habit that had finally been documented. My son-in-law's last message was short. He said he never thought things would go this far. I didn't reply. Shock has a way of teaching lessons words never can. My daughter began to plan her life again, small plans at first. A class she'd always wanted to take, a job opportunity she'd once turned down. Each step forward felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen in public. Revenge, when done right, doesn't replace pain with joy. It replaces it with balance. The scales didn't tip wildly. They simply returned to level, leaving everyone to face the weight of their own actions without interference. The noise eventually softened. Outrage always does. What remained was quieter, steadier, and far more permanent. Consequences settled into routines. Court dates replaced parties. Therapy statements replaced brand slogans. The family that once believed humiliation was harmless learned how long the shadow of a recorded moment can stretch. My daughter filed for separation without drama. No interviews, no statements, just signatures placed carefully on paper, hands steady, eyes clear. She moved forward not as someone escaping a past, but as someone choosing a future. When she packed the last of her things, she didn't look back at the boxes like they held regret. They held closure. People stopped asking me how I felt about what happened. They started asking how she was doing. That shift mattered. It meant the story had changed owners. It was no longer entertainment. It was a lesson. One afternoon, we walked past a store window filled with holiday decorations left over from another season. She paused, then smiled slightly, not bitter, not sad, just aware. Pain doesn't disappear. It finds a place to sit where it no longer controls you. The family that humiliated her issued one final apology months later, quieter than the rest, buried in a place few would see. It wasn't for forgiveness. It was for survival. By then, it didn't matter. Justice isn't about hearing the right words. It's about seeing the right changes. My daughter rebuilt herself piece by piece. Confidence returned first, then laughter, then ambition. She spoke at a small gathering once, telling her story not to shame anyone but to remind others that silence isn't weakness, it's choice. People listened differently when they realized she wasn't asking for sympathy. She was offering clarity. As for me, I learned the cost of patience without boundaries. I learned that protecting someone doesn't always mean stepping in immediately. Sometimes it means waiting until intervention can actually protect, not just react. We celebrated the next Christmas quietly. No cameras, no audience, just warmth, honesty, and a sense of earned peace. When midnight came, it didn't feel like a reminder of pain anymore. It felt like proof of distance traveled. Moral justice isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause. It arrives when the people who caused harm can no longer pretend it was harmless, and the person who suffered no longer carries it alone. The video that started everything still exists somewhere online, but it no longer defines her. It defines them. And that difference is the quiet, unshakable ending they never expected.